Good evening, and welcome back to Grave Hush. Tonight we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's national parks with 4 true, disturbing park ranger horror stories that will leave you questioning what really lurks in our protected wilderness areas. These are not fictional tales or urban legends. They're real encounters from Park Service professionals, documented by witnesses whose credibility is beyond question, and verified through incident reports that reveal secrets the National Park Service would prefer to keep buried. Our first story tonight is particularly disturbing for the human mind to understand, involving discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew about what shares our forests after dark. Let's begin. My name is Officer Daniel Matthews, and I've served as a senior park ranger in the Cherokee National Forest of Tennessee for the past 12 years. I've conducted thousands of overnight patrols through some of the most remote terrain in the southeastern United States. I've tracked lost hikers through blizzards, coordinated helicopter evacuations, and investigated everything from bear attacks to illegal drug operations hidden deep in the wilderness. I thought I understood every sound, every shadow, and every natural phenomenon these ancient forests could produce. But what happened during my patrol of Sector 7 in March 2019 still makes me question whether some areas should be closed to human access permanently. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 650,000 acres along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Much of it so remote that Park Service personnel are the only humans who visit certain areas from one year to the next. Sector 7 was one of these locations, 8 miles through terrain so rugged that even experienced backpackers avoided it during daylight hours. My assignment was routine maintenance patrol, checking trail conditions, documenting storm damage, ensuring no unauthorized camping was taking place. I'd made this patrol dozens of times, always alone, always overnight when wildlife was active and human intruders would reveal themselves through campfires or equipment noise. The first 8 miles proceeded exactly as expected. Good trail conditions despite spring rains, usual nocturnal wildlife, owls, raccoons, a small black bear that moved off when it detected my approach. My radio maintained clear contact despite the remote location and heavy forest canopy. But as I approached the halfway point, I began noticing something that didn't fit normal nighttime forest patterns. The trail surface felt different beneath my boots, less like familiar packed earth and more like walking across heated glass that had been allowed to cool. When I examined the trail with my flashlight, I discovered the source. The entire path ahead was marked with footprints unlike anything I'd encountered in 12 years of wilderness law enforcement. Roughly humanoid, but showing 3 distinct toes instead of 5. No known animal species. Each print was 14 inches long, 8 inches wide, pressed so deeply that whatever made them must have weighed several hundred pounds. But what made it truly unsettling was the condition around each footprint. The earth was warm despite the cold March night, and vegetation within 2 feet of each print had withered and died, as if exposed to intense heat. The footprints didn't follow logical patterns. Instead of continuous trail showing consistent spacing, they appeared at random locations, sometimes separated by distances requiring impossible leaps, sometimes clustered as if the creature had teleported from spot to spot. Most disturbing, some prints appeared to be sinking deeper as I watched, as if whatever made them was still present and pressing down. A metallic smell grew stronger as I followed the prints deeper into Sector 7. Not blood or copper, but something like heated metal or electrical equipment operating under high voltage. My radio started producing static bursts in regular intervals, almost like coded signals. GPS began displaying coordinates, placing me hundreds of miles from my actual position. My flashlight, high-intensity LED with fresh batteries, began dimming noticeably. The beam seemed absorbed by the forest rather than illuminating terrain. Normal nighttime sounds faded in a pattern suggesting something was systematically driving wildlife from the area. First owl calls stopped, then rustling of small animals ceased. Finally, even insects fell silent. I was walking through forest so quiet I could hear my heartbeat echoing off the trees. The footprint trail led to a section that violated every principle of natural woodland development. Instead of random organic growth, trees had been arranged in perfectly geometric formations, creating a circular clearing 50 feet in diameter. The clearing showed evidence of recent activity that was highly organized and completely inexplicable. Multiple excavation sites throughout the area, each hole exactly 3 feet in diameter, extending several feet into the forest floor. Excavated earth piled beside each hole with mathematical precision, creating uniform mounds in their own geometric pattern. But what made the scene truly horrifying was the activity taking place within this organized site. Multiple tall figures moved between holes with coordinated efficiency, producing sounds that were unmistakably communication, but unlike any language I'd ever encountered. Low-frequency vibrations that traveled through the ground into my bones rather than through air to my ears. Different figures clearly responding to each other in organized conversation, but the tone suggested intelligence operating according to principles completely different from human thought processes. Each figure stood approximately 8 feet tall when upright, but their movements displayed fluidity, indicating joints and skeletal structure unlike any terrestrial creature. They used tools that reflected my failing flashlight in ways that hurt to look at directly, as if made from materials interacting with light according to physics I didn't understand. The figures were placing objects into each hole with ritualistic care, covering them with precise earth mounds, then moving to the next location in geometric pattern. The buried objects were impossible to identify clearly but appeared cylindrical and produced faint luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the communication sounds. As I crouched behind a fallen log observing this impossible scene, all activity stopped simultaneously. Every figure turned toward my hiding place with perfectly coordinated movements as if they shared a single consciousness. In the sudden silence, I realized they'd been aware of my presence from the moment I'd entered their area. The figures began moving toward my position in formation, demonstrating both intelligence and predatory intent. Methodical and patient, cutting off escape routes while maintaining geometric precision. They viewed me not as a threat to eliminate quickly, but as a specimen to capture and study. My wilderness survival training took over. I retreated using every stealth technique learned during years of law enforcement, moving without flashlight guidance, navigating by memory and instinct rather than malfunctioning equipment. Pursuit sounds followed for several miles, but the pursuers moved through forest in ways defying normal physics. Instead of continuous sounds of large creatures crashing through underbrush, I heard movement jumping from location to location, appearing ahead, behind, to both sides without indication of how they covered such distances so quickly. I reached the trailhead just before dawn, exhausted and shaken but carrying photographic evidence and detailed notes. My first priority was contacting headquarters to request immediate backup for return investigation. But when I reviewed the photographs I'd taken of footprints and excavation site, every image showed only normal forest scenes. Trees, undergrowth, undisturbed trail surfaces with no evidence of anomalous activity. My notes remained intact, but without photographic corroboration, any official report would be dismissed as hallucination. The next morning, I returned with full investigation team, district supervisor, wildlife biologist, 2 additional rangers. Using landmark references I'd recorded, I guided them to where the geometric clearing had been operating hours earlier. We found normal forest terrain showing no evidence of excavation, geometric tree arrangement, or ground disturbance. The area matched natural woodland patterns typical of undisturbed Cherokee National Forest, with undergrowth requiring decades to develop naturally. More disturbing was complete absence of unusual footprints that had led me to the clearing. Despite detailed documentation and measurements, the trail showed only normal human boot prints and occasional animal tracks expected in the area. Over following months, I conducted dozens of unofficial investigations using off-duty time. I varied approach routes, visited during different weather and moon phases, used every tracking technique I'd developed. Despite extensive efforts, I never again encountered evidence of excavation operation or its occupants. The failure to relocate the clearing became an obsession affecting job performance and personal relationships. I began refusing remote assignments alone, experiencing insomnia and anxiety, constantly scanning forest terrain for geometric patterns or ground disturbances indicating similar operations. After 18 months of unsuccessful searching, I requested transfer to administrative duties. I retired from National Park Service in 2022, but continue hiking Cherokee National Forest regularly, carrying detailed maps and GPS equipment that might help relocate the clearing that changed my understanding of what shares our wilderness. Despite satellite imagery and advanced navigation technology, the location remains as elusive as during my first attempts to return. To this day, I know exactly what I witnessed that March night in Sector 7, but I can never prove it happened. Somewhere in the deep forests of Tennessee, intelligent entities continue their mysterious excavation work, burying objects serving purposes I can't understand. The geometric clearing exists in space that normal navigation can't locate, accessible only to those who stumble upon it during conditions beyond my ability to recreate. But I also know I'm not the only Park Service employee who has encountered organized non-human activity in remote wilderness areas. The Cherokee National Forest holds secrets that official reports will never acknowledge. And some suggest that humanity may not be alone in valuing these ancient mountains for reasons extending far beyond recreation and conservation. You think our first story was too disturbing for human minds, so now our second story will let you wonder what nature really brings and breeds. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've worked as a wildlife specialist for the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources for 14 years. I can identify any animal in these forests by sound, track, or silhouette. I've studied every species native to our region with the precision that comes from years of field observation. But what I encountered during surveys near Spruce Knob in September 2020 still makes me question whether some aspects of nature operate according to principles that no textbook ever prepared me to understand. My assignment involved nocturnal wildlife counts in old-growth forests that had been minimally impacted by human activity. 3 nights of surveys proceeded normally. Standard species, typical numbers, expected seasonal behavior patterns. On the 4th night, I began detecting anomalies. My infrared cameras triggered on thermal signatures much larger than any known regional species, but the footage showed empty forest. Near one camera station, I found tracks approximately 6 inches long showing 4 distinct pads. Feline-like, but far too large for any cat documented in West Virginia. The stride length suggested an animal nearly 4 feet at the shoulder. But what made these tracks disturbing was their association with territorial markings on trees. Instead of typical claw scratches, bark had been stripped in perfect parallel lines extending 8 feet up the trunk. No animal in our region possessed the reach or claw configuration to create such markings. Adjacent to marked trees were deer kills that displayed field dressing I'd never encountered. Carcasses opened with surgical precision, specific organs removed while others remained untouched, remaining meat arranged in patterns suggesting intelligence rather than instinctive feeding. During my 5th night, positioned in a tree stand overlooking a clearing, I observed normal wildlife activity for hours. Around 2 in the morning, all animal activity stopped simultaneously. Deer lifted heads in alert postures, raccoons froze. Even an adult bear showed nervous awareness, indicating a superior predator's presence. In the sudden silence, something large moved through forest toward the clearing, but the sounds didn't match any animal I knew. What emerged from the tree line challenged every principle of animal classification I'd learned. The creature stood 4 feet at the shoulder with muscular build and feline grace, but its head displayed features belonging to an entirely different species. Skull elongated like a wolf, with ears too pointed and positioned too high for either feline or canine anatomy. Its coat shifted color as it moved, displaying spotted patterns in some areas while showing solid coloration in others. Tail too long for a cat, too short for most canines. Most unsettling were eyes that reflected my equipment with intensity, suggesting exceptional night vision capabilities. The creature began displaying hunting behaviors that combined techniques from multiple species in biologically impossible ways. It stalked like a big cat, moving with patience through cover, but when reaching striking distance, instead of explosive feline charge, it began herding deer using coordinated movements resembling wolf-pack tactics, executed by a single animal. The deer responded with confusion mirroring my own. They couldn't categorize the threat according to instinctive recognition patterns, uncertain whether to flee from cat-like predator or defend against pack-hunting tactics. This confusion gave the creature advantages no natural predator should possess. When it finally attacked, it demonstrated physical capabilities exceeding any single species. It covered distance with explosive mountain lion speed, but used killing techniques combining throat-gripping methods of large cats with bone-crushing bite force of much larger predators. The attack ended in seconds, executed with efficiency, speaking of intelligence rather than mere instinct. But what made the kill truly disturbing was what happened afterward. Instead of feeding immediately, the creature began processing the carcass using methods suggesting problem-solving capabilities beyond typical animal intelligence. It separated different parts for different purposes, some for consumption, others for what looked like storage or transport. Over following weeks, I documented 3 more sightings. Each encounter provided evidence the creature possessed characteristics from multiple species with no business sharing genetic material. Its hunting combined solitary and pack predation, territorial behavior mixed feline and canine marking methods. Intelligence exceeded any single animal I'd studied. More disturbing was the creature's apparent awareness of my activities. It began appearing near camera stations when I was present, displaying curiosity about my equipment. During one encounter, I watched it examine a trail camera with systematic investigation suggesting understanding of human technology. The creature's behavior toward me evolved from indifference to active interest to what could only be described as stalking. I began finding tracks around my vehicle, near camps, along routes I used to access survey locations. It was learning my patterns with intelligence of a predator that had identified me as either threat or prey. During one terrifying encounter, I realized it had been following me for hours, staying just outside my flashlight beam but close enough that I could hear its breathing. When I finally gathered courage to shine my light directly at the sounds, nothing. But I could feel it watching from the darkness, evaluating me with predatory patience. My attempts to document the creature proved impossible, but not due to equipment failure. The creature seemed to understand what cameras were and actively avoided them. It would approach when I had no recording equipment, disappear the moment I tried to photograph it. This wasn't accident or coincidence. It was demonstrating intelligence that bordered on supernatural awareness. After 2 months of encounters, I prepared a report describing an unknown predator requiring immediate investigation. Department headquarters dismissed it immediately. According to official policy, no large predator matching my descriptions existed in West Virginia. My sightings were attributed to stress-induced misidentification. I was advised to take leave pending psychological evaluation. But several colleagues took my report seriously. 3 other specialists began their own investigations, 2 reporting sightings matching my descriptions. However, like my attempts, their documentation efforts failed. The creature avoided being recorded while remaining visible to direct observation. The most chilling discovery came from Ranger Sarah Mitchell, who found what appeared to be a den site. Inside a natural cave, she discovered bones arranged in geometric patterns, and scratched into the rock walls were symbols that looked almost like language. As if the creature wasn't just intelligent but was trying to communicate something. Today, 4 years later, the creature continues eluding documentation while being observed by personnel who understand what to look for. It has never been sighted during daylight hours, appearing only during darkest periods when visibility makes detailed observation challenging but not impossible. Recent sightings suggest the creature's territory has expanded throughout the Monongahela National Forest. Multiple rangers report encounters matching behavioral patterns I first observed, but these sightings never produce concrete evidence forcing official acknowledgement. What disturbs me most isn't just the creature's impossibility, but implications for our understanding of nature in areas we consider documented and controlled. The mountains of West Virginia hold secrets that textbooks never prepared us to encounter, and some suggest nature's capacity for change extends far beyond current scientific understanding. Somewhere in deep forest, a creature that should not exist continues to hunt and expand territory while avoiding documentation. But I also know other wildlife professionals have encountered impossible predators in remote wilderness areas. This ghost predator may be unique, or just one example of evolutionary experiments taking place where nature operates according to rules we haven't learned yet. Until we understand what we're really sharing these forests with, every night survey becomes exploration of the unknown rather than documentation of the familiar. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone in the woods, I can still feel those intelligent eyes watching from the darkness, waiting. This is our 3rd story of the night, and I must warn you, what you're about to hear will make you question the very ground beneath your feet. Some curses don't just haunt places, they hunt people, passing from one victim to the next like a disease that feeds on sanity itself. Once it chooses you, there is no escape, no cure, and no peace. This tale will follow you into your dreams tonight, and you'll find yourself wondering if that patch of disturbed earth in your backyard was always there, or if it appeared while you were sleeping. My name is Robert Hayes, and I served as a patrol ranger for Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina for 8 years before something forced me to resign. I was assigned to Sector 12, an isolated area that saw maybe a dozen visitors per year. October 2019 patrol began normally. Around midnight, while checking boundary lines, my flashlight illuminated something that stopped me cold. In a small clearing, 5 freshly dug graves appeared in perfect alignment, each marked with wooden crosses and mounds of dark earth that looked hours fresh. The graves were precisely 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, extending deep into the ground. What made the discovery disturbing was complete absence of access routes. No tire tracks, no tool marks, no indication how anyone had transported materials and completed such extensive excavation in dense forest. I marked the location and returned next morning with backup personnel. We found normal forest floor with decades of undisturbed leaf litter. No graves, no crosses, no disturbed soil. The ground showed natural conditions that would have required years to develop. My backup team found nothing, but I knew what I'd seen. The following month, I returned during patrol. At exactly midnight, in precisely the same arrangement, 5 fresh graves appeared. Same wooden crosses, same disturbed earth, same impossible precision. This time I brought excavation tools and began digging. For 3 hours I removed dirt that seemed to regenerate as I worked. Despite reaching impossible depths, I found nothing but more earth extending endlessly downward. By dawn, the grave had returned to its original condition, my excavation erased. The graves appeared every patrol, always at midnight, always identical. I tried different approaches, infrared cameras, motion sensors hiding for entire nights. Nothing revealed their source. The psychological toll was immediate. Insomnia, anxiety attacks, obsessive thoughts about empty graves that seemed to be waiting for something. After 8 months, I couldn't continue. The forest had become a nightmare that followed me home. I resigned, relocated to a different state, took an indoor job. For 4 years, I convinced myself that distance had broken whatever connection existed between me and that cursed clearing. Then my phone rang at 2 in the morning last week. The caller identified himself as James Morrison, the ranger who had taken over my patrol route. "You're going to think I'm crazy," he said, "but I need to ask about Sector 12, about graves that appear at midnight. 5 graves, wooden crosses, fresh dirt, every patrol, same location. I've been investigating for 6 months, but they're always gone by morning." The familiar dread settled into my stomach. Morrison described experiences identical to mine. Graves visible only to him, only at night, only during patrol duties. "Listen carefully," I told him. "This thing has chosen you now. It will follow you for the rest of your life. You'll see those graves everywhere, in dreams, reflections, peripheral vision. Every night you'll be standing in that clearing, staring at wooden crosses marking holes that are waiting to be filled." "But what do they want?" Morrison whispered. "I don't know. Maybe they're reservations, holding places for future occupants. Maybe they're reminders that death comes for everything, or maybe—" I paused, voicing the thought that had haunted me for years. "Maybe they're not empty. Maybe something is buried there that only appears when the graves are ready to receive it." "How long do I have?" he asked. "I don't know. I lasted 8 months. Maybe it's different for everyone. Maybe it depends on how long you can resist before it breaks you completely. All I know is that right now, you're the chosen one, and eventually it will move on to whoever takes over after you quit." Morrison thanked me and hung up. I haven't heard from him since, but I know he's out there conducting patrols that end with him staring at graves that exist only for him. But here's what I never told Morrison, what I've never told anyone. During my final patrol, something was different. The 5th grave, the one at the far end of the row, wasn't empty anymore. In the bottom of that hole, barely visible in my flashlight beam, I saw a wooden nameplate. The name carved into that plate was mine. Robert Hayes, with yesterday's date. I ran from that forest and never looked back, but the image burned into my memory. My name carved in wood lying at the bottom of a grave that had been waiting 8 months to receive its intended occupant. The graves weren't random supernatural harassment. They were invitations. One for each ranger who would eventually discover them, eventually be consumed by them. Morrison has no idea that one of those graves already bears his name, carved and waiting for the night he finally accepts the invitation and climbs down into the earth that has been calling to him. And after Morrison, there will be another name, another ranger, another grave prepared with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake by running. The insomnia never stopped, the anxiety never faded, and every night I dream of that wooden nameplate lying in dark earth, waiting for me to return and claim what was always meant to be mine. The graves of Pisgah National Forest aren't just supernatural phenomena. They're a collection system, gathering chosen individuals one at a time until their roster is complete. I escaped my grave, but I've never escaped the knowledge that it's still there, still waiting, still calling my name in the darkness between sleeping and waking. And someday, when the pull becomes too strong to resist, I know I'll drive back to North Carolina, hike into Sector 12, and finally answer the invitation that has been waiting patiently for my return. The graves aren't hunting us, we're being harvested. Our final story tonight is different from the others, because sometimes the most terrifying encounters aren't with ghosts or supernatural forces, but with something that walks among us wearing a human face while harboring appetites that belong to nightmares. What you're about to hear will make you question every shadow in the woods, every distant sound in the wilderness, and whether the things that hunt in our darkest places might be closer to human than we ever imagined. My name is Captain Vincent Morrison, and I've served as a senior patrol ranger for the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri for 16 years. My jurisdiction covers some of the most remote wilderness areas in the state, sections so isolated that I might be the only human presence for weeks at a time. I'm responsible for monitoring wildlife activity, investigating illegal hunting or camping, and ensuring that our protected lands remain safe for the occasional visitor brave enough to venture into truly untamed territory. Sector 9 was my most challenging assignment, a section of deep forest accessible only by a maintenance road that required four-wheel drive and hiking trails that saw maybe 3 or 4 visitors per year. The area was designated for environmental preservation, which meant minimal human interference and maximum wildlife protection. I conducted patrols there roughly every 2 weeks, spending overnight periods ensuring that poaching activities or unauthorized camping weren't occurring in areas where violations might go undetected indefinitely. The November 15th began as one of my routine visits to Sector 9. The weather was cold but clear, perfect conditions for observing wildlife behavior during the pre-winter period when animals were most active in their preparation for harsh months ahead. I'd established my temporary observation post near a natural clearing where deer typically gathered during evening hours, positioning myself with clear sight lines and wind direction that would prevent my scent from disturbing natural animal behavior patterns. Around 10:30 that evening, as I was documenting normal wildlife activity through my binoculars, I began hearing sounds that didn't match any animal species I knew from 16 years of wilderness experience. The vocalizations were low-pitched and guttural, resembling the growling of large predators, but they carried an undertone that was distinctly different from typical animal communication patterns. What made these sounds particularly unsettling was their almost human quality. The growls would occasionally break into what sounded like words or phrases, as if something was attempting to speak but lacked the proper vocal structure to form recognizable language. The sounds seemed to be coming from a heavily wooded area approximately 200 yards from my position, beyond the tree line where my vision was limited even with night observation equipment. My first instinct was to investigate using standard wildlife tracking procedures, but something about those vocalizations made me hesitate. In 16 years of ranger work, I'd encountered every type of dangerous wildlife native to Missouri forests, from black bears to mountain lions, and I'd learned to trust my instincts when animal behavior seemed abnormal or potentially threatening. Instead of approaching with my flashlight, I made the decision to conduct my investigation in complete darkness, allowing my eyes to adjust to natural night vision and avoiding the risk of startling whatever was producing those disturbing sounds. Many predators are frightened away by artificial light sources, and I wanted to observe natural behavior rather than defensive reactions to human presence. I moved slowly through the forest using techniques I'd learned during my military service before joining the park system. Silent movement, controlled breathing, stopping frequently to listen for changes in the vocalizations that might indicate I was getting closer to their source. The sounds continued as I approached, growing louder and more distinct, but also more disturbing in their almost human quality. As I reached the edge of a small ravine where the sounds seemed to be originating, I positioned myself behind a fallen oak tree that provided cover while offering a clear view of the area below. What I observed in that ravine still haunts my dreams and has fundamentally changed my understanding of what might be living in our most remote wilderness areas. In the bottom of the ravine, illuminated by pale moonlight filtering through the forest canopy, I watched a figure that appeared human in general shape and size but was wrong in every specific detail. The creature stood approximately 6 feet tall with the basic proportions of an adult human, but its movements were fluid and predatory in ways that human joints and muscles couldn't replicate. Its face was the most disturbing aspect of its appearance. The features were arranged in roughly human configuration, but the eyes were positioned incorrectly, set too far apart and angled in directions that created an expression of constant alertness that was completely inhuman. Its mouth was larger than normal human proportions would allow, and when it opened to produce those growling vocalizations, I could see teeth that had been modified or naturally developed for tearing and consuming raw flesh. The creature was covered in what appeared to be dried blood, not just around its mouth and hands, but across its entire torso, as if feeding was such a messy process that cleaning was either impossible or unnecessary. Its hair was long and matted with substances I didn't want to identify, and its skin had a grayish pallor that suggested either disease or adaptation to life without regular sunlight exposure. But what made the scene truly horrifying was what the creature was doing. It was feeding on the carcass of a white-tailed deer, but not in the manner of any natural predator I'd studied. Instead of the efficient killing and consumption patterns typical of wolves, bears, or mountain lions, this creature was eating with the deliberate, almost ritualistic method of something that derived pleasure from the process rather than simply satisfying nutritional needs. It would tear away pieces of flesh with its hands and teeth, consuming the raw meat slowly while making those growling sounds that I now realized were expressions of satisfaction rather than territorial warnings. The feeding process was methodical and thorough, as if the creature was savoring each portion rather than simply consuming protein for survival. As I watched this impossible scene, trying to process what I was observing and determine the appropriate response, the situation became infinitely worse. From behind a cluster of trees on the opposite side of the ravine, a smaller figure emerged and approached the feeding creature with the confidence of familiarity rather than the caution of prey approaching a predator. The second figure appeared to be a juvenile version of the adult, roughly the size of a human child but displaying the same wrong proportions and disturbing features. Its eyes held the same misplaced alertness, its movements showed the same inhuman fluidity, and its approach to the feeding adult suggested a family relationship that made my blood run cold. What I witnessed next violated every principle of normal family behavior, and pushed my understanding of these creatures into territory that challenged my ability to remain silent and hidden. The adult creature began sharing its meal with the juvenile, not by allowing it to feed independently, but by tearing away choice portions of the deer carcass and offering them directly to the smaller creature in a feeding ritual that was simultaneously nurturing and horrifying. The juvenile accepted these offerings with obvious enthusiasm, consuming the raw flesh with the same methodical pleasure that characterized the adult's feeding behavior. This wasn't scavenging or opportunistic feeding. This was a family unit engaging in their normal mealtime routine, and their normal routine involved the consumption of raw animal flesh in ways that suggested they had been living this lifestyle for extended periods. The implications of what I was observing began to overwhelm my ability to maintain professional objectivity. These weren't animals displaying unusual behavior or humans engaged in some extreme survival situation. They appeared to be a family unit of beings that looked human but lived according to predatory instincts and feeding requirements that belonged to an entirely different category of creature. My hands were shaking as I slowly reached for my radio to call for backup, knowing that this situation was beyond anything my training had prepared me to handle alone. But as I tried to establish contact with headquarters, I realized that my remote location and the natural barriers created by the forest terrain were preventing clear radio transmission. I was forced to make a decision between abandoning my observation post to find higher ground where radio communication might be possible, or remaining in position to continue documenting behavior that no other Park Service employee had ever reported. The creatures showed no awareness of my presence, and their feeding behavior suggested they would remain in the ravine for some time as they completed their meal. I chose to maintain my position and continue observation, hoping that prolonged study might provide insights that would help wildlife management officials understand what we were dealing with and develop appropriate response protocols. But this decision led to discoveries that made the situation even more disturbing than I had initially realized. As the adult and juvenile continued their feeding, I noticed that their consumption patterns were not random or instinctive, but followed specific procedures that suggested intelligence and possibly cultural transmission of feeding techniques. The adult was teaching the juvenile which portions of the carcass to consume first, how to tear meat in ways that maximized nutritional value, and how to position themselves relative to the food source for optimal access. This wasn't animal behavior driven by hunger and opportunity. This was learned behavior being passed from one generation to the next, suggesting a social structure and knowledge base that extended far beyond this single family unit. If these creatures were capable of teaching and learning, if they were raising their young according to established cultural patterns, then I was observing a community rather than isolated individuals. The feeding session continued for nearly 2 hours, during which time I documented behavior patterns that challenged every assumption I'd ever made about the boundary between human and animal intelligence. The creatures communicated through a combination of vocalizations, physical gestures, and what appeared to be genuine emotional responses to each other's actions. When the juvenile struggled with a particularly tough section of the carcass, the adult demonstrated proper technique with patient repetition until the younger creature mastered the skill. When feeding was completed, they engaged in what could only be described as grooming behavior, cleaning blood and debris from each other's faces and hands with careful attention to hygiene that suggested pride in their appearance. Around 1 a.m, both creatures suddenly became alert and began scanning their surroundings with intensity. That indicated they had detected something I couldn't perceive. Their body language shifted from relaxed satisfaction to defensive preparation, and they began gathering the remaining portions of their meal as if preparing for rapid departure. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the forest with stealth that exceeded anything I'd observed from natural wildlife. Despite their human-like appearance, they moved through dense underbrush without creating detectable sound, vanished into darkness that seemed to absorb them completely, and left behind only the scattered remains of their feeding site as evidence of their presence. I remained in my observation position until dawn, hoping they might return or that additional family members might appear to investigate the feeding site. But the ravine remained empty except for the deer carcass, which had been consumed with thoroughness that left only bones, hide, and portions that were apparently unsuitable for their dietary requirements. When I finally felt safe to investigate the feeding site directly, I discovered evidence that supported my observations but raised additional questions about the nature and extent of these creatures' presence in our protected wilderness areas. The ground around the carcass showed footprints that were human-like in basic structure but displayed toe spacing and arch configuration that differed from normal human foot anatomy. I documented everything I could through photography and detailed notes, then hiked to higher ground where I could establish radio contact with headquarters. My report of the incident was met with skepticism and requests for clarification that made it clear my superiors were having difficulty processing the nature of what I claimed to have observed. The response team that arrived later that day included wildlife specialists, law enforcement personnel, and medical experts who examined the feeding site and reviewed my documentation with professional thoroughness. However, their conclusions attributed the incident to known predator activity, possibly a family of bears or large cats displaying unusual feeding behavior due to environmental stresses or disease conditions. Despite official dismissal of my observations, I knew what I had witnessed, and I also knew that the creatures I'd observed were still somewhere in Sector 9, possibly with knowledge that they had been discovered by human authorities. Over the following months, I conducted additional patrols of the area using every tracking technique I'd learned during my years of wilderness experience. I found additional evidence of their presence, feeding sites, footprints, territorial markings that didn't match any known animal species, but I never again observed the creatures directly. It was as if they had adapted their behavior to avoid detection, modifying their feeding patterns and movement routes to minimize the risk of additional human contact. Other rangers began reporting unusual findings in adjacent sectors, partially consumed animal carcasses that showed feeding patterns similar to what I'd documented, strange vocalizations heard during night patrols, and the persistent feeling of being observed by intelligent entities that remained just beyond the range of human perception. But despite coordinated search efforts and the installation of motion-activated cameras throughout the region, we never obtained conclusive evidence of the creature's continued presence. They had either relocated to areas beyond our monitoring capabilities or had developed countermeasures that allowed them to avoid technological detection methods. Today, nearly 3 years after my encounter in the ravine, I continue my ranger duties with the knowledge that our protected wilderness areas may harbor communities of beings that exist on the boundary between human and animal classification. The experience has changed my approach to every patrol, every investigation, and every moment I spend alone in remote forest areas. I no longer assume that unusual sounds or disturbed wildlife patterns have conventional explanations, and I've developed heightened awareness of the possibility that predatory intelligence might be observing my activities with the same scientific curiosity that I direct toward the natural world around me. The creatures I observed that November night remain unidentified and unclassified by official wildlife management standards, but they continue to influence forest ecosystem behavior in ways that suggest their presence is ongoing and their adaptation to human encroachment is evolving. Somewhere in the deep wilderness of Missouri, a family of beings that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of human evolution continues to hunt, feed, and raise their young according to cultural patterns that predate our civilization. What disturbs me most about this knowledge isn't the creatures themselves, but the implications of their existence for our assumptions about what forms intelligence might take, and what communities might be thriving in areas we consider uninhabited. The boundary between human and animal may be far more complex than our science has yet discovered, and some of those boundary-crossing entities may be watching us with the same fascination and concern that we direct toward endangered species in need of protection. In the darkness beyond our campfires and flashlights, ancient forms of intelligence continue to practice survival strategies that have allowed them to remain hidden from human detection for generations. But they're still there, still hunting, still raising their families, and still adapting to a world where their greatest threat comes from the very species they most closely resemble.